It's difficult to overestimate the influence of Sternhold and Hopkins' whole book of Psalms. They were published in 1562 during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, and since that time, up until the present day, this book has gone through over 1,000 editions. For 3 centuries, this was the psalm book that everyone in England would have heard of, would have sang from in church, and would have sang privately at home or while they were working. These psalms were known by everyone and influenced a popular taste in poetry. And so we're going to be looking at in this lecture what was the quality of the poetry and how exactly did it influence the course of devotional literature. Now, in the 1560s, the English church was really coming to terms with its own identity as a Protestant church. Thomas Sternhold had begun translating psalms in the court of King Henry VIII. When the English church broke from the Roman Catholic Church, he first started translating the poems for entertainment purposes, and they were very popular in the court, so he just kept adding on to them. Under the reign of King Henry VI, that would be Henry VIII's son, he added more and published a new edition, and these were sung and celebrated in the court of Edward VI as well. Now, during the reign of Queen Mary, the Catholic queen, when the Protestant church was under persecution, the psalms were published elsewhere or circulated privately. But when Elizabeth I came to the throne, she wanted to architect a Protestant English church that could accommodate the sympathies of Roman Catholicism to an extent, without the doctrine, and also the more reformed aspects. Now, with this break, the English church began to shrug off the decorations of the Roman Catholic Church, the incense, the gold, the statues, the stained glass depicting Christ and saints, and instead they wanted plain churches. They wanted a religion centered on the Word and not so much on visual or artistic stimuli. And what this meant for poetry at this time was that poetry should be, they believed, a true Protestant poetry should be plain, not ornate. And so translators began to wrestle with this. Well, how much is too far? Is all figurative language bad? Should we always prioritize the literal over the figurative meaning? And so these questions lived on and echoed through the poetry of English piety for 3 centuries. And this is really where it started. So we're going to be looking about how this book worked as a standard for English devotional poetry, either as the model or as the anti-model. Now, the book of Psalms come from the Hebrew poetry in the Hebrew Bible, which was later adopted by the Christian church in the 1st century. Now, the Psalms have had an enormous place, a central place in the Christian church. St. Athanasius in the 4th century catalogs various ways you can use the Psalms. He says that the Psalms are like a garden. If you think of the Bible as a forest where each book is a tree whereon grows a certain kind of fruit, well, in the Psalms, you have a garden of all the trees. So everything that is in the Bible is in the Psalms. This really provided a map for Christian piety so that you were never in want of a prayer. Now, there are 2 things we'll keep in mind in this lecture. And the first thing is the enormous influence of this book, even though it's not really talked about a lot. And most people don't even know this book exists. Secondly, we're going to be treating these translations as poetry. Now, these are not lesser poems simply because they are derivative. It's a translation of a psalm from the Hebrew or the Greek into English. And whenever you translate a poem into another language, what you get is not a translation, but another poem, because the language itself has changed. And so we're going to be looking at these poems as poems in their own right. Once these psalms were translated into vernacular language, into English, they were adapted for public use. In fact, there's a note in the publication of the whole book of Psalms by Sternhold and Hopkins that says that they hope that these psalms will basically replace ballads. And so what the translators did was they translated these psalms into ballad forms. It allowed the psalms to really replace popular ballad culture. But it also meant that anyone, even if they couldn't read, could recite the psalms and could learn the psalms. Something that might be surprising and that often gets missed by us is that the psalms were sung for fun. They were originally a source of entertainment in the court and among average people. The only thing English readers liked more than a Petrarchan love song or a sonnet was a psalm. The English poet John Lely in his proto-novel Euphues describes how in Italy they chant sonnets, but in England they sing psalms. There was this craze about the psalms. They were fun. They were informative, and they were interesting. And there was a proliferation of psalm translations. One other thing to note about this culturally is that when people went to church, they didn't sing hymns. It really wasn't until the 19th century that hymns began replacing psalms. When you went to church, you had a psalm book, and instead of singing Amazing Grace, you would sing perhaps Psalm 23 or something. But it was considered irreverent to sing a man-made song in corporate worship, and it was devotionally correct to sing scripture in worship. So this is something too to keep in mind. This is how people were picking up the Psalms. They'd go to church, they'd hear it, they'd memorize it, they'd take it back with them. So this really influenced the popular taste. Now, what are the translations like? Well, I hope you'll explore the link that I've provided in the description below. There's a digitized copy from 1564, which was scanned by Princeton, put on the Internet Archive. I have that here, and you can toggle through and explore. Let's look at Psalm 23 and talk about the quality of this song. Here's Psalm 23. Here's one version, and here's another. This one is by W.W. Let's look at this. This one's fascinating. So that's the first stanza zoomed in. This psalm was translated by William Whittingham. So it wasn't all done by Sternhold and Hopkins at this point. William Whittingham knew John Calvin's circle very well. In fact, he married Calvin's sister. So he returns to England, and he's very reformed. He's very Puritan. And so he actually omits the key metaphor here. We all have heard Psalm 23. The King James Version, published in 1611, would translate it the following: "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures, and leadeth me beside the still waters." It's a beautiful psalm, celebrated for its metaphor, this metaphoric relationship between God and the speaker as a shepherd to a sheep. Well, William Whittingham, what does he do with it? Here we have, "The Lord is only my support, and he that doth me feed. How can I then lack anything, whereof I stand in need?" You'll note that it's in common measure. This is alternating lines of 4 stressed syllables, followed by 3 stressed syllables. This is the meter that you can sing Amazing Grace to. So you can actually sing this to the tune of Amazing Grace. Or if you're feeling irreverent, to the House of the Rising Sun, or Gilligan's Island. Any common measure tune you can sing this to. And most of the tunes that people knew back then were ballads. But what's just so jarring about this is the omission of figurative language. And so Whittingham obviously was very concerned about, well, what should I prioritize, the literal meaning or the figure? If these are common people reading this, will they misread the figurative language, the metaphor? He's totally taken away the beauty of this psalm, I think, in prioritizing the literal over the figurative. This is, I think, why Thomas Sternhold supplied his translation, which we see just after this one. So let me scroll up, scroll over and up. Yeah, here we are. Another of the same by T.S. Thomas Sternhold. And here's his, which is not bad. "My shepherd is the living Lord, nothing therefore I need. In pastures fair with waters calm, he set me for to feed." Again, it's in common measure, but Thomas Sternhold has managed to preserve both the literal sense and the figurative here. I think this one was the favored of the two. But you can get a sense for the priorities of these translators. Was it proper to use a figure, even if that's in the Bible? Would it lead to misunderstanding? Is it irreverent? All these questions were questions that they wrestled with. Poets and critics have not looked fondly down upon the Sternhold and Hopkins Psalter. Thomas Fuller, the church historian in 1655, wrote that Thomas Sternhold and Hopkins were men whose piety was better than their poetry. They had drunk more from Jordan than of Helicon, Jordan being the river in Israel of the Hebrews, and Helicon being the spring in Greece from which the Greek poet Hesiod drank. John Dryden in the late 17th century would basically say the same thing. In fact, it's interesting. He points to the Sternhold and Hopkins Psalter as the reason why the public taste is not to be depended upon. He says, "Do we not see them stick to Hopkins and Sternhold's psalms and forsake those of David?" I mean, Sandy's translation of them. That would be George Sandy's translation. "If by the people you understand the multitude, the hoi polloi, 'Tis no matter what they think, they are sometimes in the right, sometimes in the wrong, and their judgment is a mere lottery. Earlier in the 17th century, George Withers would complain of the same thing, essentially. He says that this Psalter was full of absurdities, solecisms, improprieties, nonsense, and impertinent circumlocutions, to more than half the length of the originals in some places. And these judgments are, on the whole, correct. Psalm 42 in Sternhold's edition is just not as elegant as the King James Version. In fact, it's nearly twice as long. Psalm 18 tends to be kind of absurd. So, despite all this, despite the fact that the quality of the poetry is not good, it was incredibly popular. So throughout the Sidney Psalter that we're going to look at next, throughout George Herbert's poetry even, John Donne, the poetry of Isaac Watts and the Wesley brothers, they're all wrestling with this question of what place does style have in devotional poetry? Should it be plain like the Sternhold and Hopkins, or can it be beautiful? Can we make it figurative? Can poetry be poetic and still be reverent? When some of the Protestants began countering fiction, imaginative literature, as something to be wary of, Sir Philip Sidney wrote his A Defense of Poetry in essentially A Defense of Imaginative Literature. And it wasn't just Protestants who were interested in this. This is a long debate going all the way back to Philostratus, the Greek. So to say that this was a Puritan issue is really to misunderstand it. And it's one that English poetry, English devotional poetry, will worry about extensively. Now I'm going to leave you with this excerpt from Donald Davies' introduction to his Oxford Book of Christian Poetry. He actually says that the plain style served a purpose, an artful purpose of elevating emotion, and that it actually aided the reader in piety more than clever and ornate verse would have. Davies says, "There is something called devotional verse, to which it may seem that this criterion for artistry need not, and probably should not, apply. For it is not hard to think of verses which, though deficient in artistry, could well, because of the purity and sweetness of their spiritual sentiment, minister to the private worshipper in his devotions more effectively than verse which is a great deal better written." And so there's this case to be made that, well, perhaps plain poetry is actually properly plain poetry. Samuel Johnson, the 18th century critic, would come to say that devotional poetry simply cannot be good, or cannot excel, simply because it can't say anything new without being heterodox, and it can't really say something that's already been said, among other reasons, as we'll see. So these are some very important considerations that we can take from the Sternhold and Hopkins Psalter. Definitely check out the link below and read through this edition for yourself. It's very interesting. And let me know in the comments if you find anything worth mentioning here. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you all in the next video.